global borrowing has been growing rapidly, so rapidly that many are concerned it is quickly becoming unsustainable. The Institute of International Finance estimates total worldwide debt, which is made up of borrowings from households, companies and government, surged to a staggering $253 trillion at the end of September 2019. That's a whole lot of debt, more than 3 times the annual economic output of the entire world. It works out to roughly $32,500 of debt for each of the 7.7 billion people on the planet. What's more, the group says this figure is only going to increase. The World Bank believes the speed and scale of this debt wave is something we should all be worried about. So much so, the group has urged governments around the world to make it a primary concern. But let's take it a step back. Put simply, debt is created when one party borrows from another. It allows individuals to buy something they wouldn't normally be able to afford. That has its benefits. The cost of this service is the interest rate. At present, interest rates around the world have fallen to historically low levels. This has made it cheap to borrow from banks, meaning businesses can make large investments and homeowners don't need to spend as much on their monthly mortgage payments. There are drawbacks to a low-rate environment though. Individuals aren't likely to see much of a return on their savings, and both people and businesses could load up on too much cheap debt, something we're seeing now. Governments take on debt too, which they can use to stimulate the economy by funding infrastructure projects, social programs, and more. How much a country's government owes is known as sovereign debt. Sovereign debt is very different to how we might think about debt as an individual. But one thing they both have in common is that problems tend to arise when that borrowing becomes excessive. Loans to countries with developed economies, like Canada, Denmark or Singapore, are generally seen as safe investments. That's because even if governments spend beyond their means, lawmakers can raise taxes or print more money to ensure they pay back what they owe. But loans to governments in emerging markets are generally seen as much riskier, which is why these countries will sometimes issue debt in a foreign, more stable currency. Although this allows them to attract more investors from abroad looking for bigger returns, an economic slump, weak home currency, or a high debt burden can make it difficult for the government to pay them back. Ultimately, the most important risk when it comes to national borrowing is that a country may fall behind on its debt obligations and default. This isn't common, but it has happened. Take Lebanon in 2020, Argentina in 2001, and Russia in 1998. Over the last 50 years, there have been 4 waves of debt accumulation. We're currently in the midst of the 4th wave. So, what can we learn from the first 3? Well, for one, none of them have had a happy ending. Enter the 3rd global debt wave, which lasted from 2002 to 2009. At the end of the previous century, the United States removed barriers between commercial and investment banks, while the European Union encouraged cross-border connections between lenders. This paved the way for the formation of so-called mega banks. These banks led the way in a sharp increase in private sector borrowing, particularly in Europe and Central Asia. Defaults in the US subprime mortgage system piled more and more pressure on the country's financial system, pushing it to the brink of collapse in the second half of 2007 and 2008. The shockwaves reverberated across the world, with one economy after another falling into deep, albeit short-lived, recession. In the US, the 2009 recession was so severe that output from the world's largest economy sank to its lowest level since the Great Depression. The World Bank says we're currently in the midst of the 4th wave of global debt. And if we're to avoid history repeating itself yet again, governments must make debt management and transparency a top priority. This wave of global debt is thought to share many of the same characteristics as the previous 3, including prolonged periods of low interest rates and changing financial landscapes which encourage more borrowing. But the World Bank has called the current wave the largest, fastest and most broad-based of them all. It involves a concurrent build-up of both public and private debt, involves new types of creditors, and is much more global. However, as the coronavirus pandemic threatens to sink the world economy, the moment for stemming the tide may have passed.